Welcome, 6th grade history students. This is our last video of the year. Whew, can you guys believe it? It's crazy stuff, how quickly it's gone. But we're going to do this last video, and then you'll be ready to fill out your study guide and take your test on ancient Japan. So today, we're going to talk about religion, government, feudal Japan, and the Mongols. And normally, if you're going to study something like this, it's going to take a lot longer than just a section of the chapter. But as I have reminded you, our class is just an overview. So let's get started. Religion during the Heian period. Religion during the Heian period was a part of everyday life. People didn't separate religion from the way they lived their lives every day. It was very important to them, and it was part of who they were and how they did things. The Japanese had an interesting blend of Shintoism and Buddhism. According to our book, what they did was the Japanese would worship at Shinto shrines to get help for their daily lives. They would worship in Buddhist temples to prepare for the life to come. So they sort of blended the two and used one for the here and now and one for what would come after. Religion very much was instrumental in shaping the culture of Japan. Art, architecture, education was all shaped by the religions of ancient Japan, much like every culture has been shaped by its religions, and people are shaped by whatever it is they worship, and it was no different in Japan. Government in Japan. During the Heian period, Japan had a very strong central government. Remember me telling you that the emperor had sent some people to China to learn about Chinese government. But this strong central government was challenged. Instead of the emperor being an authority, what ended up happening was key posts in government began to be occupied by a few very powerful families. One of the most powerful families was the Fujiwara family. If you're looking in your book on page 355, you'll see Fujiwara in bold in your book. This is not in your notes, but I just want to draw your attention to it because it probably will be on your test. The Fujiwara family was very interesting in that anytime they had a daughter, they would have their daughter marry the sons of the imperial family. So anybody that was related to the emperor was part of the imperial family, and so the Fujiwara family would have their daughters marry into the imperial family. And then an heir would be born to one of these daughters, and what would happen was whoever was the reigning emperor would be forced to give up his throne, and a Fujiwara court official would rule as regent for the infant emperor. So they had, a Fujiwara daughter marry an imperial son, and when that woman had a son, they would force the current emperor off of his throne and put the baby on the throne as emperor. Baby can't be emperor. Baby's got to have somebody help it rule. Well, conveniently, one of the Fujiwara men would rule as regent in that baby's name. So, a regent is a person who rules in the place of the rightful ruler because that ruler is unable to fulfill their duties, whether it's because they're, a baby or whether they're sick or whatever reason. Okay, so as regents of Japan, the Fujiwara family controlled a lot of the government during most of the Heian period. The Heian period was from 794 to 1185 AD, or CE. Those are the same thing, depending on what history book you're reading, but they're the same thing. They became very wealthy, they became very powerful, and what often goes along with wealth and power is corruption. They became very corrupt, and by 1156, Japan was embroiled in a civil war because of that corruption. around 30 years of fighting. So they fought this civil war for a little less than 30 years. The power struggle ended, and the rule of Japan shifted from the emperor to military officials. Now, the line of the imperial family actually continued. There was still an emperor. The emperor just didn't have any power. Just kind of weird to be an emperor with no power, but there you go. And this began the feudal age of Japan. Now, you'll remember us talking about the feudal period in Europe. This is similar with some differences, but you're going to see a lot of similarities. It's going to be, I think, interesting. So let's talk about feudal Japan. We're on page 357 in your book and 195 in your workbook. Here we go. Now, during the late Heian period was when this feudal system of social classes began to develop. Now, feudalism. Feudalism is a system for organizing society and governing society, and it's based on social classes, but its foundation is around land, who owns the land and who serves whom. The ruler, whoever's the ruler at the top, divides the land among the peasants in exchange for loyalty and allegiance. Now, I want you to take a minute, if you've got your workbook, and I want you to go over to page 205 in your workbook. And I want you to look at the top of 205. There is a social pyramid. You remember we talked about this with Egypt. We've talked about the social pyramid several times. Who's at the top, who's at the bottom. Okay? So you're going to want to pay attention to what we're about to talk about for your study guide. Okay? All right. So, at the top of the Japanese feudal system were the emperor, the emperor's family, and the military leaders. The emperor, so emperor, emperor's family, military leaders. The emperor was the religious leader of Japan at this time, but he didn't have any real political power. The military leader was called the shogun. The shogun. You may have heard this word before. If you've ever watched any movies about ancient Japan or feudal Japan, you may have heard the word shogun. A very famous book came out, I think, in the 1960s called Shogun by James Michener, I think. It's a really interesting book, but it was all about, this is an epic novel about feudal Japan. But the shogun was the military leader. He was chosen by the emperor, and the shogun had supreme political power. In 1192, there was a man named Yoritomo, who was the leader of the Minamoto clan. And he was appointed the first shogun because he's the one that won the war among the clans. He became the supreme military leader. He set up his government from the city of Kamakura. And this military government is known as a shogunate. A shogunate. Shoguns ruled for 700 years. While the imperial emperor, again, like I said, had no real power, but was the official ruler. So ruler in name only. If you look on 357, there's a chart there that shows you the setup of Japanese feudal society. Okay? So, next in line, right? So you have the emperor and the military leader, the shogun. Next you have the daimyo. Daimyo, I think is how that's said. If I have any friends who know Japanese listening, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Daimyo. They were the chief nobles or the most powerful warlords. So daimyo up here, so you can see how to spell that, and warlords. The daimyo had the military power and the economic power to rule over their lands. So these would be like the, when we were talking about feudal Europe, um, the religious leaders, the Pope, and then you have the kings, right? And these are the lords. Um, and they had control over their land. They also had armies to protect their lands and workers to work on them. The daimyo that were the most powerful were usually the ones that would end up becoming the shogun. The armies of the daimyo, this is what some of you have been waiting for very excitedly, because everybody loves a samurai, right? We all like to talk about the samurai. I know my sons have always been obsessed with learning about the samurai, and I don't know, they've got pretty cool armor. If you look at the picture on 358, I mean, they're pretty cool looking. But let's talk about the samurai. The daimyo's army were made up of samurai, and if we're going to continue our analogy to feudal Europe, this would be like the knights. Okay? Samurai. Samurai, if you were a samurai warrior, you had to master several skills. You had to master the skill of horsemanship. That was very important. You had to master the skill of fencing. That's the art of sword fighting. And you had to master archery, which is your bow and arrow shooting. And some, of course, mastered it from the back of the horse, which is even more difficult. And then they also had to master something called jujitsu. You've probably heard of that. People study it today as a martial art. It's a form of self-defense that uses no weapons, but jujitsu. The samurai worked under the daimyo. Their duty, their most important job, was to protect the daimyo. A samurai had some privileges that other people did not have, and I thought this was very interesting when I read it. They were able to have a surname. A samurai was allowed to have a last name. I think that's very interesting that other people didn't. A samurai was allowed to have a family crest. That's a symbol that symbolizes your family. And the samurai had the right to carry 2 swords as opposed to just 1. The samurai had a very strict code of honor, much like the knights of Europe were required to live by the code of chivalry, or they were supposed to. They certainly didn't always. The samurai was expected to live by a code of conduct. And this code of conduct is called the Way of the Warrior, and it was something that required a lot of the samurai. They had to be loyal, they had to be honorable, they had to fulfill their duty, they had to be devoted to justice, they had to be courageous, sincere, which means truthful in their motivations, and they had to be polite. Remember, Japanese culture is one, even today, that is very big on manners and on politeness and civility. The last class of the Japanese feudal system is the peasant class. The peasants were divided into several subclasses, and this is actually where we differ a little bit more from European feudalism. In the peasant class, all of these people were peasants, but the highest class of peasants was actually the farmers, which is not necessarily the same in feudal Europe. The farmers were the highest ranking peasants. If a farmer owned his own land, he was higher ranking than a farmer who rented his land from someone else. Farmers were valued because they produced food, and that was very important. If you remember, one of the things we talked about how is Japan is a very mountainous country, and there's not a lot of arable farmland in Japan, and so farmers were very highly regarded. They paid their taxes not in money but in food. So they would raise the food and then they would pay their taxes based on what they raised. The next subclass of peasants were the artisans. The artisans. Artisans were people who made things from metal or from wood. Tools, fish hooks and anchors, swords, other weapons, those kinds of things, things that were used by other people. The last peasant class were the merchants. And when we talk about the rise of the merchant class in Europe, and how they, because they had money, they became important, but the merchants were actually the lowest of the peasant classes. And the reason they were considered the lowest of the peasant classes in Japan is because they were relied on other people for their livelihood. So traders and shopkeepers were part of this subclass. The earliest Japanese people had been mainly fishermen and hunters. As society grew and changed and other needs became apparent, people began doing other jobs and evolved into the Japan of this era. If you look on page 359, you'll see at the top a painting from the late 1500s of farmers paying taxes to their local daimyo, and they're paying him in rice. Okay. Now let's talk about the Mongols. Now, the Mongols are very interesting. We're not going to get to study a lot about the Mongols. We're just going to talk about them as they relate to Japan. Next year, when we take the 7th and 8th grade world history class, you'll get to learn a little bit more about the Mongols in detail, and they are really, really interesting people. Okay, so in the late 1200s, the Mongols actually attacked Japan twice. They failed both times. The second invasion, this is so funny to me. I mean, it's sad that a lot of people died, but it's still kind of funny. The Japanese samurai fought the Mongols for 53 days. 53 days they're fighting. As they're fighting, all of a sudden, the sky gets dark and this huge typhoon comes in. It sweeps across the Sea of Japan. The Mongol fleet is basically destroyed, most of it. Many of the Mongols drowned, and basically the Japanese won this particular battle because the wind was on their side. So the Mongols that weren't killed by the storm, many of the ones that were left were killed by the samurai, and this Mongol invasion failed. The Japanese actually named this storm kamikaze. Now, you've probably heard that word in conjunction with World War II, so we'll talk about that in a second. But kamikaze means divine wind. The Japanese believed that spirits had sent the kamikaze to help defend them from the Mongols. Now, this fight against the Mongols drained the treasury of Japan. I have said this before, I will continue saying it for as long as I'm teaching history. War is expensive. It is so expensive, and it costs money, and it costs land, and it costs lives. And the samurai were very angry because the government didn't pay them, mainly because they didn't have the money to do it. Because of that, the shoguns began to lose power, and over the next 500 years after this second Mongol invasion, power struggles continued, and Japan at this point isolated itself from the rest of the world, so that it adopted a policy of isolation, didn't allow people really in or out, didn't engage much with the outside world after that. Now, just real quick, here's a freebie. The kamikaze, divine wind that saved the saved the Japanese from the Mongols, was used in World War II as a name for a particular class of Japanese pilots. And what they would do is they would deliberately, this class of Japanese pilots would deliberately try to crash their planes into an enemy ship. The belief was that the highest gift you could give the emperor was the gift of your own life. And in kamikaze warfare, what the Japanese would do is they would load these planes, if they were poorly built or out of date with explosives, and let inexperienced pilots fly them. So they didn't waste their experienced pilots on kamikaze missions. They only had to dive into a ship. Many of the kamikaze missions were stopped, but many got through. And these attacks crippled or destroyed around 300 U.S. warships in the last 10 months of World War II. So I think that that's very interesting that they used this term, divine wind, to describe what they were doing there. Okay, that's it for chapter 13, and that's it for history for this school year. Oh my goodness, I am really proud of how far we've gotten and how you guys finished all but 2 chapters in the book, which is amazing. I'm very proud of you. So all you have to do now is the rest of this week work on your study guide and take your test and get that turned in. And see you next year.